Greetings all, D&Disability here. I watched Dungeon Craft's video, D&D Data, the Corrupt Story the Wizards does not want you to know about, the other day, and he said something in passing that sparked my interest. He mentioned player versus DM-centered games, i.e. some games are more focused on the DM, determining the abilities and freedoms of the characters, while others give the players these abilities by default. And, to be clear, this wasn't the main point of his video, nor did he really define what he meant in explicit terms. However, I'd like to try and do so now. So, in this video, we'll cover the aspects of player and DM-centered games and what they could mean for players with disabilities. Now, in short, these categories are kind of like two major groups that we could separate all TTRPGs into, with some being in the player camp and some clearly being in the DM camp and others not really in either, or kind of somewhere in between in the middle where it gets really muddy. But what do we mean with this kind of big zoom out description? What is it good for? Well, primarily I think this line of thinking is useful when we consider exactly what RPGs we want to start taking up. Do we like ones that handle, like, say, Osric or OD&D that have a lot of freedom for the DM, a lot of wiggle room? Or do we like stuff like 5e or 3rd edition, where it's become more and more kind of codified, more specific over the years? So, before I get ahead of myself, let's jump in and define our terms. Player-centered games have a series of characteristics that I've kind of come up with. There are 6 in total. Number 1, they kind of go by the phrase rules, not rulings. Systems like D&D 5e and Pathfinder really have become codified and lay out with specific rules. And those of you might note that 5e started with the motto, rulings not rules, but the game has really shifted to be something else over these years. Number 2, characters tend to have backstories. Character backgrounds matter by default. Number 3, the player and DM work together to tell a story. In other words, the game has built-in tools to facilitate this mechanic. One example, before you start typing your angry comments, is such as characters having the ability to insert NPCs into the game of their own free will, or characters having the ability to modify their dice rolls by rolling either an entirely different die, or simply modify their dice as in, I don't like that roll, let me roll again, such as what Morkborg does, as an example. Number 4, the player characters tend to be more powerful by default. You're really focused on telling the story of heroes in these games. You're not as focused on coming up from a 0-level dirt farming peasant and then becoming somebody. Now, 5 is an interesting one. It's an observation, which is turns tend to take longer in player-centered games. And this is largely because of the increased options player-centered games have. There's more characters can do, and there are more options on the character sheet, and this often takes far more time for players to figure out what they want to do, and it also takes time to adjudicate rules decisions as players or game masters try to look up the rule, cross-reference, and go from there. So number 6 here kind of goes hand in hand with that. Player-centered games might be overwhelming to new players due to their rules. Sometimes we have this kind of standing statement of just pick up the d20 or roll, or tell the DM what you want to do, and the DM will tell you what you need to do, which is all well and good, except for the fact that sometimes those new DMs need to know all of these rules, or need to know a fair portion of them, or have to have some kind of conception of them, as opposed to more rudimentary games that are often more DM-centered, which put less pressure on the DM to follow the rules of the game, instead making their own judgment calls based on the scenario. But that brings me into the other half of our discussion today, which is for DM-centered games, or at least games with DM-centered characteristics. So, here I have actually 5 points for this one. Number 1, these RPGs tend to reward experienced players. However, the fewer rules that exist within these games might be welcoming to new players who often feel overwhelmed with, oh god, I have to account for flanking, and I have to account for this bonus because I moved this turn, and this penalty because I'm firing my gun offhand, and this penalty because I'm standing upside down on a Tuesday, right? Those kind of action-oriented bonus penalty systems that are often character-centered systems, player-centered systems, can be overwhelming for some players. Number 2, DM-centered games follow the adage, rulings not rules. This is where, of course, 5e started, but other RPGs like Morkborg and Dreamweaver excel at this, where they don't emphasize, or at least heavily emphasize, the role of rules in the game, encouraging DMs to adapt rules as needed. And yes, I know in D&D there is this, the elastic clause, basically, that says the DM can make any rules they want, but that's not what I'm talking about here. Alright, so number 3. The story/narrative tends to be driven largely by the DM. That is to say, the characters have less power to change the adventure with the abilities on their sheet alone. As an example, once again, players can't simply insert NPCs, for example. And to me, this might seem like a point of contention, because it is the dice and the actions as described by the characters that tell the story. But this is true for both DM-centered and player-centered games. Player-centered games have this extra crunch, so to speak, where they can add in more content to the game that concretely will shape the game world. Number 4 is kind of a caveat to this point, which is that the OSR developed the West Marches style of gameplay to overcome this particular hurdle, the particular hurdle of characters not having a ton of agency. Because in a West Marches game, characters move in and out of the party, and the party really dictates what goes on. But typically, when we consider the OSR, it is often the DM sits down with a module, or the DM sits down with an adventure, and this is the game we're going to run today. And even if you are running a sandbox, you still have to play within the bounds of the sandbox. This is part of kind of respecting the nature of play. Now, number 5 is kind of a somewhat controversial point as well. GM-centered games are often simpler and allow for faster play. Characters, I should say players, don't require 5 minutes to go and look up a ruling. They don't have to spend 5 minutes sitting at their character sheet going, what of my 27 abilities do I want to do? And even if you are a caster, right, and you have those overwhelming options, but that's only one small subset of the game. That's not for every class. If you compare a fighter in, say, OD&D versus a fighter in 5th edition, you will see one has many more options than the other. As an example, one requires more consideration than the other. Magic items and other external forces aside. So, what does this have to do with the disabled player experience? Well, I find that GM-centered games offer a GM-driven narrative that is often easier for new players to pick up. It requires simpler character sheets with fewer rules and therefore might be easier for those with learning disabilities. However, they often require more flexible or experienced DMs to make the game work. As a DM, you'll find yourself making rulings on the fly quite often. And additionally, the limited power options for characters might be distasteful to some players that want more of a modern D&D game. They want more crunch, in other words. Player-centered games put the players in the driver's seat by default. Their established rule systems tend to account for most situations, but DMs may find themselves having to stop the game and check the rules repeatedly, depending on the kind of players you have, if you have rules lawyers, for example. For some, the extra character options will be freeing, since they have a concrete list of what they can and can't do, what they are good at and what they are bad at. But for others, these more defined abilities will feel limiting, and combat will usually take much longer, and the chances of slog increase as players struggle to decide which abilities they should use. For players with ADHD in particular, player-centered games can be quite the struggle. So let's sort some standard TTRPGs into two camps, shall we? Let's start with the DM-oriented camp, right? The DM-centered camp. We have RPG systems like Basic Fantasy, Morkborg, OD&D, Basic D&D, Dreamweaver, Gumshoe, Traveler, 1E-ish, Osric-ish, and even 2nd edition if we exclude the skills and feats editions that kind of came later to the game. Now, on the player-centered side, we have editions like 3rd, 4th, and 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons, Pathfinder, Mouse Guard, 2nd edition D&D if you include the classes and skill functions, games like Call of Cthulhu, the Warhammer RPG system, Rollmaster, and the Middle-earth RPG are all lesser within this category, right? They tend more towards the middle, because while they give players, say, concrete options, they don't really always let players kind of insert characters into the narrative by default. Obviously, this list excludes disability-oriented RPGs like Sign and Survival of the Able, as I have not played those. Feel free to debate about which TTRPG goes where in the comments section down below. Let me know what RPGs I didn't mention as well. I'd love to hear it. I hope this line of thinking can help you narrow down what TTRPG works for your table. I never thought about them this way until I watched Dungeon Craft and he mentioned it, so a big thanks to him for it. Remember to like, share, subscribe, and you stick around for more RPG, academic, and disability-oriented content. Take it easy.